Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to be talking about choosing and evaluating sources. I'm Elizabeth Bentling-Simon, co-founder and head of learning experiences at Inquire Ed. And I'm just really excited to have this conversation following up the amazing keynote from Sam Weinberg. I'm really feeling grateful to him for joining us today and talking about sources, which is something that I'm really passionate about and excited to talk with you all about as well. Just reviewing a few of our norms, we'll be working mostly in large group, but we'll also be going to breakout rooms a few times to talk through some ideas. So just kind of keep in mind, encouraging everyone to go microphone on, camera on when you're in those small breakout rooms to the extent that you're comfortable doing so. Oops, sorry about that. So this session, I want to define our focus a bit in thinking about why we're talking about sources, why we're talking about sources with inquiry, and how this relates to us as inquiry practitioners in the elementary classroom in particular, as we begin to develop student skills. Sorry, it's going crazy there for me. Thinking about developing our guidelines. So how are we thinking about the sources that we're selecting? How are we selecting them? And what supports do we have when we're thinking about the guidelines we use for evaluating sources and selecting sources? We're going to do a little bit of real-time practice just to kind of spark some ideas, generate some questions, and think about what it's actually like and some of the challenges that comes with as well. And then we also want to think about connecting to our students' skills and the ways that our skills and applying our lens when selecting sources connects to the skills that we want our students to develop as well. And coming right out of the keynote, I also want to just kind of put a finer point on what Sam was emphasizing around developing those critical analysis skills in students. And that's something that's really important. It's something we want to talk about in this session, but also thinking about sources we're using, not always thinking like a historian or critiquing a narrative, but just using to gather information and how sources that we're putting in front of our students have different purposes. So we're going to talk about kind of those two different goals as well. So starting out, defining our focus, why sources matter so much in inquiry and in an elementary classroom in particular. I would invite you to think back to your own student experience, because I was reflecting on this morning, thinking about my own experience and how my thinking about sources in social studies instruction in particular have really shifted for me. And when I think back to my experience as a student in a language arts classroom, as I was learning to read, becoming a reader, K-12 in my educational experience, I encountered a lot of different kinds of texts. We learned to read, to analyze different kinds of texts, thinking about the text structure. Is this comparing and contrasting, or is this persuading me? Is this a short story, or is it a poem? We spent a lot of time learning to analyze the text that we were reading to help us make meaning of the information. And it kind of went without saying, I think, possibly, probably for you as well, that you encountered not only different types of sources, but you also encountered different authors and different genres of literature. This goes without saying in a language arts classroom. In my social studies experience, however, if you can kind of shift gears and think about your social studies experience as a student, this happened for me 0 times that I can recall. The sources of information in my social studies classes were generally 2 things: the textbook or a workbook and my teacher. Every once in a while, maybe pop in a video or something like that. But for the most part, I was listening or I was reading and I was remembering. And my job was not to analyze the information or to think about the author's purpose or to dissect what type of source I was looking at. My job was just to remember the information that was in that book or that my teacher was telling me. And it wasn't always a lecture, right? Sometimes it was a hands-on activity. It was a game. It was a song that we were singing to remember whatever, the state capitals. But I wasn't really analyzing that information ever. I was really just remembering it. That was my primary job. And I think that experience continued through my training as a pre-service teacher. And even in the early days of my teaching career, really thinking about my job as helping students remember information so that they could give it back to me later on some kind of assessment. And a shift in my practice is thinking about how in the social studies classroom, those critical skills, those disciplinary skills of unpacking information, analyzing information, gathering evidence, comparing evidence, those disciplinary skills in social studies, not just thinking like a historian, but thinking like an economist or a geographer or a civic agent. Those are all really critical skills that don't just fall into the language arts world, and don't just fall into the media literacy world, but are really critical to the development of those disciplinary literacy skills. So it's really exciting for me to see inquiry really taking off in social studies in the elementary classroom, and teachers really, generating some enthusiasm and some excitement around finding sources that can help students develop those skills. So some questions we have as we think about that: how do we find and choose and evaluate high quality sources? And how do students evaluate and learn from sources themselves? We have some catching up to do. When we think about our curricular materials, often teachers are provided with a workbook or a textbook, so a single source of information, single author or group of authors. And perhaps there's maybe, some primary sources embedded within those materials, but they're framed in a particular way. And in other cases, teachers have no curricular materials in social studies. They're stuck trying to find them and leaning heavily on the internet or various source providers that may or may not be high quality because they're not being given necessarily the tools they need for success. So we have a lot of work to do. It exists, and it's something that we're really passionate about. But that's where we want to begin, and kind of thinking about, we have a lot of pathways on the internet or perhaps in our classroom or classroom library where we can select and find some varied sources, but we need to make some decisions. How do we curate them? How do we make decisions about what we put in front of students? So now we're going to move into developing guidelines. Now I want to be clear, we're not going super deep on every rubric criterion that you might have when you're developing your own rubric for evaluating sources. We just want to kind of spark some thinking here, and we're going to share some additional evaluation tools with you at the end of the session. So before teachers bring a source of information in front of students, they should be certain that it's worth their students' focus and investigation. I think this is particularly true. You might have experienced this yourself in your own classroom with young students who may have emergent, very nascent skills with evaluating sources, with finding their own sources, with doing internet research. If they're just learning to read, they're going to have a hard time comparing sources and evaluating them. So we need to be cautious and thoughtful when we're thinking about how we bring different sources in front of children, and making sure that we're feeling good about their purpose and their usefulness and their appropriateness for our students. So here's just a sampling of must-have criteria. I think this is an abbreviated list, and certainly, again, we'll provide some additional rubrics that can go into some more detail with some, sub-criteria. But we'd just love you to look at this for a moment and kind of think about how this checks in with your kind of internal checklist or other checklists that you use when you're thinking about how you might find a text, an image, a photograph, or a video that you might show students in your classroom as they're investigating a particular topic. And also invite you to think, what do each of these words mean to you when you're thinking about this with your students? So we have this checklist, these things that we want to keep in mind. Now we're good to go, right? We can just kind of find things that meet this criteria, and then we can move on with great sources. So simple, right? The real work is messy. Here are just so many quotes or challenges or questions that have come up when we talk about this with teachers all the time. You might have experienced this in your own classroom. How does it work? What if I choose the wrong source? What if I make a mistake? What if the source isn't accurate? And I can't tell. What if parents kind of give pushback against the source? I'm comfortable leaning on my textbook or my provided materials, and how do I navigate this messy area of finding, selecting, and evaluating sources? So that's where we're going to begin today, is just kind of thinking about what we keep in mind when we're choosing and selecting a source that we might put in front of students as they investigate a particular topic. So we're going to roll up our sleeves here. And before we begin this, we want to do a little bit of housekeeping and kind of figure out, what breakout rooms we'll be working in for our discussions. So we're going to come back to the whole group to do a little bit of brainstorming. But we want to begin by just introducing ourselves to each other. So in a few seconds, and Ashley and Martin are going to be assigning these and kind of doing some housekeeping and organization. We're going to move into those rooms for about 3 minutes. And we might go up to 5 on this, because I think there are a lot of bubbling ideas from the keynote that might be exciting to talk through a bit longer. Your task during this short period of time is turn on your camera and microphone if you're able to, and just do whip around intros. Share your name, your grade, and your role, your location, and something from the keynote that really resonated with you, whether it was something that really confirmed what you believe, sparked some thinking, or perhaps challenged your thinking in some way. Be sure to note the number of your breakout room, because when we come back together, we're going to be doing some whole group activities, but within certain Jamboard pages that are relevant to or consistent with the breakout room that you're assigned to. So that'll be an important thing to track. Martin, do you have anything? All right, it looks like everyone's rejoining us. Thank you so much for jumping.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Yep.
Sorry, Elizabeth.
That's okay. It's not a Zoom if someone doesn't talk while they're muted, right? Sorry about that, guys. Thanks for your patience. Was just saying, it looks like everyone's rejoining us. So thanks so much for jumping into those rooms. Hopefully you tracked which breakout room you're in, because we're going to be doing some quick brainstorming related to those rooms here in just a moment. But would love to have you share something from your small group discussion that you just came out of, something that resonated with you or someone else in your chat that really came up for discussion in your small groups from the keynote, or anything else that came out that was really resonant or buzzing around in your mind after that quick breakout. Thank you so much. So great to kind of hear or see rather different ideas that are coming up, and what really sparked for you. We're going to move now into thinking about each of those criteria, and it's okay if you don't remember them, because we're going to show them again in just a moment. Each of those criteria we showed you in that checklist, what questions you might ask yourself when you're encountering a particular source and you're wondering, would this be good for me to use in my classroom as my students engage in inquiry, as they're investigating a topic? So a guiding question can take many forms and serve many purposes. But for us right now, a guiding question is going to give us direction when we're evaluating a particular resource. And to create an effective guiding question, the first thing you're going to consider is, what would you ask yourself if you were looking at this, whatever, picture, article, video, anything that you might use in your classroom for instruction? What might you ask yourself? If you were evaluating an inquiry curriculum, for example, a guiding question might be, is this curriculum designed around meaningful, compelling questions? Does it prompt students to take informed action? So those might be questions that I would ask myself if I was looking at a curriculum and wondering, to what extent is this inquiry based? If I was in a non-educational setting, if I was thinking about ordering a pizza, for example, and I might be asking myself, my criterion is that this pizza is going to make everyone in my family happy. I might be asking myself, does it include all the toppings that my picky eaters want and exclude all of the toppings that they'll whine about? So those might be guiding questions for me as I'm searching the pizza menu. So really, they're just things that kind of guide us to evaluate a particular criterion. And that's what we're going to begin to do right now. So this looks really complicated, but it's not. This is just a sample inquiry Jamboard using that criterion of compelling and supporting questions. So you're going to be looking at a Jamboard in just a moment related to your breakout room. And you're going to be thinking about just one of those criterion, so relevance, appropriateness, representative, what have you. And think about, if you are looking at a particular source and you are thinking about just that domain, what questions might you ask yourself? We're not going to be thinking about all of them at once. We're not going to be trying to analyze, all areas of a rubric. We're just going to start to spark some thinking. And you're not going to get this wrong here at all. It's really a brainstorm or a question storm, so to speak. So I'm going to move into the next piece of this by handing it over to Martin. And Martin's going to share with you how to access your particular Jamboard and how to add your ideas to it. So if we look at this example here, you probably can't read them, but these are a whole bunch of questions that are related to that criterion of integrating compelling questions. And you're going to add those right here, just in this gray section. Ignore the other sections for now, because we're going to get to that later. Martin, go ahead and take it from here.
Yeah, no, it's similar to what we did yesterday. You can just go to the odd or even Jamboard that if you're in an odd breakout room or an even breakout room, and then scroll through the Jamboard and find your breakout room number. Take 3 minutes to, or take a few minutes maybe together to read the definition the proposed definition for representative or credible or accurate, whatever criteria you have. And then take 3 minutes to question storm as much as possible on a new yellow Post-it note for each question that you would ask yourself if you were evaluating a resource for its accuracy, credibility, representativeness, what have you. So we're going to do this right now as a whole group instead of sending you back to breakout rooms. So just right now, go to that Jamboard and start jamming on some questions, as many as you can. And Elizabeth, if you want to click on one of those links that Ashley shared, I think we probably would be taken over and we'd see a Jamboard being populated in action. And wouldn't that be exciting?
That would be exciting. I will do that. I'm going to go ahead and start the timer because otherwise I won't be able to keep track of it. So we've got 3 minutes on the clock, and we will try to address questions as well. So next, what we're going to do is take a moment to read each other's questions and think about which ones really resonate with you. So read each other's questions and think about which of these are like, yeah, this one is really the same question that I would want to ask. It resonates with me. This feels really important. And prioritize those questions by selecting the 3 that feel the most critical. Doesn't mean they're the only ones that we should be asking, but for the sake of this activity, the 3 that feel the most critical to you, and then use the stylus tool in the Jamboard to put a plus sign or a star or somehow note that particular question. And this is a way in this, remote setting that we can kind of cluster questions and identify questions that resonate with the most people in a particular group by just quickly tagging them. We're going to take about 1 minute to 2 minutes to do that. Just read through and then star or plus the ones that really work for you. So now comes the fun part. You're going to go back into those breakout rooms now. Everyone that you just introduced yourself to and shared a few thoughts with has been adding questions, has been starring questions that resonated with them. And we're now going to select the 3 questions that feel like the majority of people in this group, it was resonating with them. They feel the most distinct from one another and important to ask. And you're going to take those questions and you're going to drag them over here on the right to where you see those green placeholders. So in this model here, you can see 3 of the questions from the gray square yellow Post-its have now been dragged over here to the right. And now instead of question 1, 2, 3, we actually see the questions. You don't need to turn them green. That's just there as a placeholder for you. Then what you're going to do is you're going to think about generating look-fors for those 3 questions. So kind of 2 tasks here in your breakout room. One is to narrow your questions down and move them over to the right side. So we've got a new area for work. And the second is to identify those look-fors. And we can think of look-fors as a piece of evidence that will help us answer our question. So it's specific, it's observable, it indicates that a source is meeting the challenge of that particular guiding question. So for example, our example that we gave before is the curriculum design around meaningful, compelling questions. I might look for compelling questions that are re-examined throughout the unit. I might look for units beginning with an engaging introduction to that compelling question. To use my pizza analogy again, I might look for evidence on that pizza menu of particular toppings, or I might look for evidence of toppings to avoid that would help me answer that particular question. On the learning experience team, we spent a lot of time digging into this evidence that we can see. And often we get into spirited debate around a particular source. We might not have agreement around the answer to our question. One person might think that it's working for this reason, and someone else might think something else. And so really getting down into that evidence within a source can help us make determinations about whether or not we might want to use a source or how we might want to use a source. So again, in your breakout rooms, you're going to select 3, you're going to move them onto that placeholder area, then together as a group, generate as many look-fors as you can for each of those guiding questions. And if your time allows, cluster them, organize them, maybe eliminate duplicates if you feel like you have a lot, but that's kind of an if time allows thing. For now, it's important to just start thinking about what you might look for when you're looking at that particular source. So it looks like folks are rejoining us. Thank you so much for taking time to generate those ideas for look-fors and to think deeply about what you look at when you're evaluating a source and what you're thinking about as you're making selections. We're going to move on and do a little bit of quick practice. In Choir Ed, we don't use a textbook or a workbook at all. Every source of information comes from a variety of sources. And so we have to choose carefully and select every single source. And we have lots of different purposes for sources that we might use. So in some cases, students are using a source to gather information about a topic. And when that's the case, we want to make sure that the information within that source is something that we feel really good about. So here is an image that we're thinking about using for a 5th grade classroom. Apologies again. Thank you so much for your patience. That's frustrating for you all, I'm sure, and appreciate your patience there. This is an image for a 5th grade lesson. And the goals here, students will be able to generate and evaluate widely held beliefs about the event known as the first Thanksgiving. They're thinking about evaluating historians' claims and historical evidence, and they're investigating theories about interactions between the Wampanoag people and English colonists during the harvest celebration of 1621. This is a painting painted in 1912. The title of the painting is The First Thanksgiving. So based on your guiding questions and look-fors, would you recommend using this source? And would invite you just in the chat to share your thoughts. Do you think that this source is accurate, credible, representative, appropriate, relevant? Would you think about using a source like this in your classroom? And if you don't mind sharing in the chat, share that look for or that rationale. might use because, would use because, would not use because. So here's how we evaluated this source at Inquire Ed. We determined that the image depicting this first Thanksgiving is not accurate, does not accurately represent what actually happened. It's not particularly credible. The artist painted this many, many years, centuries after the event happened. Does not feel representative of the people who were involved, and does not necessarily represent all points of view. We're not sure it's appropriate for the grade level even, thinking about what's being depicted here. But we did determine that this was actually really relevant, relevant to our purposes of helping students to analyze commonly held beliefs and to weigh that against historical evidence. So in this particular lesson, students are thinking about commonly held narratives and the ways in which historical evidence actually aligns to those narratives or intentionally rebuts those narratives or causes us to kind of challenge our thinking. So in this case, the particular source was used, but it was not used as a way to gather information about the event. It was used as a way to develop those historical thinking skills and to develop those sourcing skills that Sam Weinberg thought about or was talking about in terms of sourcing, in terms of contextualization. So when we add our student skills to this, we can think about asking them some questions that can help them develop that criticality. So in this case, we might ask questions like, what does the story seem to be suggested in this painting? What is this painting suggested? What parts of the painting suggest that story? What are the clues that the artist includes here to help us think about the story that's being told? What's shaping our understanding? This painting was created in 1912 about an event that happened in 1621. So how might that affect the accuracy? What's the context in which this painting was created, and what sourcing skills can we use when we're thinking about, does this represent what happened? I've seen this picture in a history book. Is this like a photograph? This is what took place? Or might there be things that help us to think about the extent to which the artist was representing reality versus an image that they had in their mind? What viewpoints do we think are represented? What viewpoints might be left out? And then ultimately, what problems might arise from using a single source to understand a historical event? And what other sources might we use to learn more information? Doesn't mean a painting like this is bad. It doesn't mean that any one particular source is a problematic source, but we can use sources like this, even if they are not depicting accurate information, to help students understand that single sources and single narratives are actually problematic, and that seeking different perspectives will help us to have a fuller understanding of what actually happened in a historical event. So in this case, we chose to use this particular source, but we had a very specific purpose. I would have said it's not appropriate to use a source like this to learn about the historical event and what actually happened, because it's not accurate. But it is appropriate to use a source like this when we're thinking about historical sources and developing those analysis skills, again, that Sam talked about. So, jumping backwards in time to that video, which we're not going to show, this was a source that we actually opted to not use. It had some problematic content in the way that communities were depicted. Representation was particularly a problem in this video. And this is not a video in which first graders were critiquing the role of a historian. They weren't critiquing a source. They weren't, in this particular lesson, using sources to analyze how authors or artists depict communities. They were just trying to learn about types of communities. And ultimately, we felt that this was not a good representation of types of communities. And so it struggled in the departments of accuracy in terms of representation and in terms of appropriateness. So there's a spoiler there. You can feel free to watch that video on your own later to kind of consider your own criteria. Last thing I'd like to share with you is just a poster. This will be available in our hub for you later in thinking about very simple scaffolding in sourcing skills with very young students. And so this is a poster that we use really often in our K2 curriculum, but also through 3.5 through 3.6 actually, in helping students to develop some source analysis skill and thinking about when they're encountering a text, a video, an image, who made it? Why was it made? What kind of information is in a source like this? How, what might the benefits or limitations be? Even very young children can think about what kind of information is in a written text versus a photograph, or a primary source like an interview, and think about how, you know, thoughts and feelings and what something was really like for an individual might be in an interview, but what we might not have is broader historical context, or how that individual's perception might impact their experience of an event. And so would love to share that with you and invite you to use that in your classroom. Also have a selection of sources. We only scratch the surface here, thinking about questions we ask and criteria that we might use to evaluate, but lots of sources that you can use to develop your own rubric that's more robust as an individual or within your teams or teachers that you support as you're thinking about selecting and evaluating sources for use in your classroom. And also want to just really encourage you to, you know, give it a shot. Don't rely on a single source. Don't rely on that textbook or workbook, but also acknowledge that it's really hard work. It's not easy to find lots and lots of sources. It's not easy to make those decisions, and give yourself some grace and know that, you know, we all make mistakes, and to lean on other team members and thought partners who are also in this work with you as you shift to an inquiry-based practice or develop your inquiry-based practice. Martin, I think we're probably running pretty tight on time since we started a bit late. So I would love to take questions and comments, but want to kind of turn it over to you in terms of timing before the next session.
Yeah, why don't we, people are active in the chat and they're posting things on Padlet. That's great. Other questions or comments or issues that people are running into when they're out there looking for sources. Now is the time to ask some questions, because really Elizabeth and her team spend a lot of time going through sources and vetting them for accuracy and credibility and representation. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll stay here for a few minutes. You can actually just, sure, Kristen, you can totally unmute if Ashley can unmute Kristen, and you can ask a question live rather than typing it in a chat. That'd be
absolutely.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for the session and learning the last 2 days. So fast question, well, not really fast, but question on sources. So in looking for elementary, elementary age appropriate sources, specifically for like Indigenous people, I guess we'll go that route. Is there anywhere that you've had more luck than others? Because I go down rabbit holes and I'm in the weeds, and it's hard to find, and it takes a lot of time. So yeah, anything to help shortcut that and make it more productive would be great.
Yeah. I would also invite anyone in the chat who's had good luck to kind of share sources as well. I think we have encountered this exact pain point, Kristen, many times when we're developing materials for students. I think particularly for young readers, in an effort to make things simple and readable. Often things are oversimplified, and misconceptions, things that have to be unlearned later, are really problematic. So we've leaned really heavily on the National Museum of the American Indian, looking at their resources, particularly resources that have been created, curated, or informed by Indigenous scholars. That's been really helpful. Also going directly to tribal resources has been helpful, not always as a source for finding grade level texts, but if you're looking at images, artifacts, looking at oral storytelling as a historical source. There are great resources from tribal providers, as well as, even on YouTube, you have to do a little source analysis yourself to kind of track down, who published this particular source. Is this person actually an Indigenous scholar, or are they just sharing a story virtually? So we try to really lean into finding source providers who have connections to the communities that are being represented. Martin, I'm drawing a blank here on, I want to just kind of hand you like a list of go-to sources. So I need to pull some up a little bit more thoughtfully here, but those are some source providers that we've leaned pretty heavily on. Also, looking at the Center for Indian Law can be a place to look for language and nomenclature.
Great. Other questions, or specifically around, we're getting a lot that sources for K, for 1, for 2, and we know the difficulty of finding that grade level sources. Other ideas about that just in general, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so in our practice, at Inquire Ed, we use a lot of video and imagery sources that can be framed by the teacher, because often we have emergent readers, readers with different, language needs, and thinking about ways that we can help students acquire information in a non-written format. And that can help when you're trying to find that grade level friendly text. That can be a real challenge. We have a lot of different partners that we work with when we're trying to find text, but also looking at historical images, photographs. The Library of Congress is a great starting point. Students who are very young, they might not be able to read a text necessarily, but they can definitely observe things in an image. We use picture books a lot also. If we're thinking about content like that video, like Needs and Wants, or families, or people in places around the world, we lean pretty heavily on picture books, either fiction or nonfiction, to help students draw connections, even through some pretty complex historical topics. Also, I think a great starting point, if you have access to source providers that are free to teachers, sources like Epic Books for Kids, or ReadWorks, organizations like that provide pretty decent high quality texts that you might be able to access as a teacher.
And I'm going to share something, and I haven't asked for permission from the powers that be at Inquire Ed, but
that's what was pausing me too. I was like,
I'm just going to do it, and then maybe get in trouble later. It's always better to apologize than ask for permission. We're creating something that's a free resource called the Source Project. And what we're trying to do is gather all the videos that we can, that we've vetted, that we've looked at. And then we've tried to create Spanish voiceover for many of them. And then we're going to post them through lots of different agreements on a neutral site, so that you don't necessarily always have to view them through YouTube and be surprised by the ads that come up. And this, everyone, is such a work in process. Like I said, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be able to share it or not, but it's just called the sourceproject.inquireed.org. And we're just, eventually you'll be able to search it by subject and by grade and all those fancy things. But it's really just a place that I would check back there later as the year progresses, and see it's going to grow and become, but it's really our independent, like, open source idea of just trying to vet sources and put them in one place so people can search for them. So it'll be fun, and then I'll see if I get an angry message from someone at Inquire, but that's not ready to share yet. But it's out there now, so you can go back and check it out.